The year is 52 BC. On the hills of Alesia, a fortress rises against the gray Gallic sky like a final clenched fist defying the inevitable. Within the stone and timber walls, 80,000 warriors prepare for what they know will be their last battle. But this isn't a story about those warriors. This is the story of the women watching from the highest windows. Queen Eporedorix, though that wasn't exactly her title as the Gauls didn't use Roman words for power, presses her palm against the cold stone of the tower. Her fingers trace the ancient druid marks carved centuries before, symbols of protection that now seem cruelly ironic. Below, beyond the triple fortifications her people built in desperation, the Roman legions stretch as far as the eye can see. But it's not the legions that haunt her. It's the stakes. Thousands of them, pointed inward, creating a circle of death around Alesia. Caesar isn't merely besieging the fortress. He's creating a trap within a trap, a labyrinth of starvation and despair from which there is no escape. And Eporedorix knows something her warriors haven't fully grasped yet. The Romans didn't come merely to conquer territory. They came to erase an entire civilization. What happened in the following weeks wasn't recorded in Caesar's triumphant accounts. You won't find it in the elegant pages of Commentaries on the Gallic War, the truth about what the legions did when the gates finally opened. That truth was buried, literally, until archaeologists discovered something extraordinary in 2003. Beneath the ruins of a Roman villa built over Alesia, there was a secret cellar. Inside it, chains still attached to the walls. And on the stones, scratches. Words in ancient Gaulish, carved with nails and bones. Names of women. Prayers to gods that Rome was determined to make disappear. And one phrase repeated dozens of times, like a mantra against horror: "We are more than bodies." 6 months earlier. Understanding the fate of the Gallic queens requires going back to when everything was still possible. When Gaul wasn't a map of Roman provinces, but a living mosaic of tribes, each with their own queens, druids, and forms of power that Rome could barely comprehend. Queen Eporedorix wasn't born to rule. In Gallic culture, power wasn't automatically inherited by blood, but earned through 3 things: wisdom in council, courage in battle, and the ability to hear the gods through the druids. She had all 3. When she was 16, Eporedorix was among the women who defended the oppidum of Bibracte against Germanic invaders. Not in the background, not carrying supplies, but on the wall, with a sword that weighed almost as much as she did, fighting alongside men who quickly learned that strength has no gender when survival is at stake. At 22, she sat in the Council of Elders and proposed an alliance that saved 3 tribes from starvation during a brutal winter. Her voice, calm, methodically building each argument like a craftsman builds a wall, convinced men who had twice her age and triple her pride. At 28, the Druids recognized something rare in her: the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. Dreams that became prophecies. Intuitions that saved lives. When Caesar's legions first appeared on the Gallic horizon in 58 BC, Eporedorix was among the first leaders to understand that this wasn't just another tribal war. It was systematic extermination disguised as civilization. She tried to warn the other tribal chiefs. "You don't understand," she said at a council that gathered representatives from 12 tribes. "The Romans don't fight to conquer territory. They fight to erase memories. Where they pass, our stories die. Our gods are renamed. Our children forget who they were." An older chief laughed. "They're just men in red armor. We fought worse." "No," Eporedorix replied, and her voice had that quality that made experienced warriors pay attention. "They are a machine. And we are the grain that will be ground." She was right. But not even she imagined how literally that metaphor would become reality. To fully understand the horror of what was coming, you need to comprehend something about how Gallic societies functioned, and how radically different that was from Rome. In Gaul, women could own property. They could divorce. They could inherit. They could rule not as temporary regents but as leaders in their own right. Boudica, the famous British queen who rebelled against Rome, wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a Celtic tradition of female leadership that stretched back centuries. More importantly, in Gallic culture, a person's body, especially a person of power, was considered sacred. To profane it wasn't just violence. It was blasphemy. It was attacking the very connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. The Romans understood this perfectly. And they used that understanding as a weapon. Caesar wasn't an idiot. He was one of the most intelligent and calculating men who ever commanded armies. He understood that conquering territory was easy. Well-trained legionaries could take any fortress. But breaking the spirit of a people? Making them stop resisting not just with weapons but with identity? that required something more surgical. Something that attacked the core of what they held sacred. The Gallic queens were more than political leaders. They were living symbols of their people's connection to their ancestors. They were considered bearers of a spiritual lineage that stretched back to the first days of the tribes. To profane them was to profane the entire tribe. Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. The siege of Alesia lasted 42 days. During that time, Eporedorix maintained order within the walls through pure force of will. When food ran out, she organized rationing. When the sick began to outnumber the healers, she herself learned to clean wounds and apply poultices. When despair threatened to turn into mutiny, she climbed the walls and reminded her people of all the invasions they'd survived before. But she knew the truth. Everyone knew. On the 30th day of the siege, the tribal leaders made a decision that would haunt them until their last moments. There were women, children, and elderly inside Alesia, people who couldn't fight, but who consumed food that didn't exist. The decision was to send them away, hoping Caesar would allow them to pass through the Roman lines. Eporedorix voted against it. She knew what would happen. Caesar didn't let them pass, nor did he let them return. 15,000 people, mothers carrying babies, children holding grandparents' hands, young people who'd never held a sword, were trapped between the walls of Alesia and the Roman fortifications. In no man's land. Dying slowly of starvation while both sides watched. From the top of her tower, Eporedorix could hear them at night. Children crying. Mothers pleading. And then, gradually, silence. It was after that she began carving into stone. Not military orders or battle strategies. Stories. Songs her people had sung for 1,000 years. Names of ancestral heroes. The exact words the Druids used to bless newborns. She was trying to create a backup of her people's memory. Because she'd already understood that bodies could be rebuilt, but cultures, once erased, disappeared forever. The 42nd day dawned with fog. Inside Alesia, the warriors were so weak they could barely hold spears. There had been no food for 6 days. Horses had been eaten weeks ago. Shield leather had been boiled to make soup. People chewed tree bark and tried not to think about what they were doing. That's when the news arrived. A relief army was approaching. 250,000 Gallic warriors from tribes that had finally understood that if Alesia fell, they all would fall. For a moment there was hope. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal in antiquity. The Gauls attacked the Roman fortifications from outside while the defenders of Alesia attacked from inside. For hours it seemed they might win. The Roman lines bent. Centurions shouted desperate orders. Caesar himself took up arms and entered the fight. But the legions were machines. Trained to hold formation even when the world was collapsing. Conditioned to follow orders even when every instinct screamed to flee. When the sun set, the relief army was in retreat. And inside Alesia, the last hope died. Eporedorix gathered the remaining leaders that night. They sat in a hall that smelled of smoke, blood, and defeat. No one spoke. What was there to say? It was Vercingetorix, the great warrior chief who had united the Gallic tribes for the first time in history, who finally broke the silence. "I'm going to surrender," he said. "Caesar wants a symbol. I'll give him one. Maybe he'll spare the rest." Eporedorix looked at him. This magnificent man who had dreamed of freeing Gaul. This warrior who had defeated Romans in open battle. This leader who was now proposing to sacrifice himself based on the fragile hope that Caesar had honor. "He won't spare anyone," she said calmly. "And you know it. Then what do you propose?" "That I go with you. That all of us, all the queens, all the women of leadership, surrender as well. If Caesar wants symbols to destroy, let him destroy those who chose to carry the weight of leadership. Not the children who might still forget who they were." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding of what she was really saying. It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable. To choose how to die when there was no longer choice about whether to die. Vercingetorix agreed. Eporedorix and 12 other queens and women leaders agreed. They didn't know, no one could know, that death would have been mercy. The surrender happened at dawn. Vercingetorix wore his finest armor, the one he'd worn in triumphs, polished until it shone like gold under the sun. He mounted his warhorse, the one that had carried him through 12 battles. And he rode alone through the gates of Alesia toward the Roman lines. Behind him, at a respectful distance, walked the 13 women. They wore no armor. They wore the robes of their offices, council garments, symbols of their tribes, the marks that identified who they were to their people. Eporedorix led. Her steps were steady. Her head was high. If she was afraid, and she was, terror that made her ribs seem too small to contain her pounding heart, No one could tell by looking at her. The legions formed a corridor. Thousands of men in red armor, motionless as statues, watching as their enemies walked to surrender. The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Caesar waited on an elevated platform. He wore the ceremonial armor of a triumphant general, complete with the purple cape that signaled imperium, absolute power. At his side stood his lieutenants, men who had overseen the massacre of entire villages without blinking. Vercingetorix stopped before the platform. For a long moment, the two men looked at each other. The Gallic warrior and the Roman general. Resistance and the machine. Then Vercingetorix dismounted. He removed his armor, piece by piece, letting it fall to the ground. Finally, he removed his sword, that legendary sword that had drunk Roman blood, and laid it at Caesar's feet. And knelt. The symbol was complete. The leader of Gallic resistance, subjugated before the power of Rome. Caesar didn't even look at him. His eyes were on the women. "Arrest them," he said calmly. Separately. Eporedorix was taken to a tent that smelled of leather and metal. Chains were fastened to her wrists, not common iron but ornate chains engraved with Roman symbols. It was a characteristic touch. Even the shackles were designed to communicate power. She waited for hours. No one came. No one spoke to her. She could hear sounds from the camp outside, orders being shouted, horses neighing, the constant clink of metal against metal. And occasionally, coming from other tents, sounds that made her close her eyes and pray to gods she didn't know were still listening. Screams. From women. When Caesar finally entered her tent, it was already night. He came alone, which somehow was worse than if he'd brought guards. It meant he didn't consider her even a threat. He studied her for a long moment. His eyes had that quality she'd seen in predators. Not active cruelty but cold indifference to the suffering of prey. "Do you understand Latin?" he finally asked. "Yes." Her voice was steady. "Small victories." "Good. Then you can comprehend what I'm going to explain." He sat, not in the elaborate chair that had been prepared, but on a simple stool. As if wanting to suggest this was just casual conversation. "I've spent 8 years in this miserable land. 8 years fighting tribes that can't unite long enough to form a real nation. Brave warriors certainly. But brave like wolves are brave, effective in small packs, useless at anything larger." Eporedorix said nothing. She'd learned long ago that men like Caesar rarely asked real questions. They made speeches using your presence as an audience. "You Gauls don't understand civilization," Caesar continued. "You build fortresses of wood and straw and call yourselves kings. You allow women," and here his eye passed over her with calculated contempt, "to make decisions about war and peace. Quaint. Almost charming, the way a child playing soldier is charming. And yet," Eporedorix said calmly, "it took you 8 years to defeat us." The silence that followed was dangerous. She saw something pass across Caesar's face, surprise that she'd spoken, anger at the observation. But then he smiled. It was the smile of a snake. "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, it did. And you know why? Not because of your warriors. Not because of your fortresses. Because of women like you. Women who should be at home spinning wool and raising children, but who somehow convinced foolish men to listen to them. Women who spread ideas of resistance when they should be spreading legs to produce the next generation." He stood, walked to her. Eporedorix forced herself not to step back, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. "So here's what's going to happen," Caesar said, now close enough that she could see the small scars on his face, reminders of battles he'd survived. "Vercingetorix will be taken to Rome. He'll sit in a cell for 6 years while I arrange my triumph. Then he'll be paraded through the streets in chains, so every Roman citizen can see the great Gallic warrior humiliated. After that he'll be strangled in the Tullianum. A quick death, almost merciful." He paused, letting the word merciful hang in the air like a blade. "You and your fellow queens, however?" His voice became even softer. "You'll have a different fate. Because you represent something that needs to be completely eradicated. The idea that women can lead. The idea that your barbarism has value. The idea that Gaul is anything more than a Roman province waiting to be properly civilized. You're going to kill us?" Eporedorix said. It wasn't a question. "Oh no." Caesar smiled again. "Not immediately. Death is an ending. And endings create martyrs. Martyrs create legends. Legends create resistance. No, queen," and the way he said the word made it an insult, "you're going to live. You're going to live in a way that ensures every Gaul, every barbarian beyond our borders, understands exactly what happens to those who defy Rome. Eporedorix couldn't know, that her words were being overheard. In the shadow outside the tent, a Roman scribe named Lucius Varenus was doing what scribes do, recording. He'd been ordered by Caesar to document everything about the conquest of Gaul, material that would be used for official reports and eventually for Caesar's commentaries. But Lucius was a complicated man. He came from a plebeian family that had risen through hard work and loyalty to Rome. He believed in the empire, in its civilizing mission. And yet, in recent weeks, watching the siege of Alesia, he'd begun to question. There's something about witnessing mass starvation, 15,000 people dying slowly in no man's land, that makes a man reconsider his certainties. He wrote down every word of Caesar's that night. And when Caesar left Eporedorix's tent, Lucius kept recording. The screams from the other tents. The orders given to centurions. The specific details of how the queens were to be processed. It was this document, discovered in 1998 in a French monastery, hidden inside the binding of a medieval manuscript, that finally revealed the truth. Lucius Varenus had created a secret copy of his records, an unedited version that included everything Caesar's official commentaries omitted. It took 2,000 years, but finally his words found light. The processing began the next morning. The 13 queens were brought to the center of the Roman camp, where a platform had been erected overnight. Around it, the legions were formed, not in battle posture but as spectators, witnesses to what was coming. From the walls of Alesia, the surviving Gauls watched. Caesar had made sure they could see. That was the point. Eporedorix looked at her fellow queens. Women she'd known for years. Some were friends. One was a distant cousin. All had ruled wisely. All had tried to save their people. And all understood in that moment that the next minutes would define not just their fates, but the fate of every Gallic woman who came after them. Caesar mounted the platform. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. The silence of 60,000 soldiers was amplification enough. Legionaries of Rome, he began, and his voice had that quality of command that transformed words into law. You've spent 8 years civilizing this land. 8 years teaching these barbarians what it means to be governed by law, by order, by the rationality of Rome. And during these 8 years, you've faced resistance that defied our expectations. He paused, letting his words settle. That resistance didn't come just from warriors. It came from something more pernicious. It came from the barbaric idea that women, can make decisions about war and peace. That they can rule tribes. That they can defy what nature has clearly established as the proper order of things. Eporedorix felt anger rising in her chest. Not for the first time, she wished she'd died fighting on the walls. These women before you, Caesar continued, gesturing to the queens, represent everything that's wrong with Gallic society. They've abandoned their proper places. They've confused men who should have known better. They've planted seeds of resistance that cost Roman lives. He descended from the platform, walked among the queens. He stopped before each one, studying them like a merchant would study cattle. So today, he said, and now there was something terrible in his voice, something that made even hardened legionaries shift uncomfortably. Today we're going to correct them. We're going to teach them, and through them teach all of Gaul, what the proper role of women is in a civilized world. He made a signal. Centurions stepped forward. What happened in the following hours won't be described in graphic detail here. Not because it's too brutal for words, though it is, but because there's dignity that must be respected even when telling stories of atrocities. But here's what needs to be understood. What the Romans did wasn't simple violence. It was ritualistic. It was designed. Every act had purpose. Every humiliation had objective. The queens were stripped before the legions and the watching Gauls. Not just stripped. Their hair was cut, their clothes torn in specific ways, tribal symbols painted on their bodies were washed away. It was literal erasure of identity. Then began what the Romans called domestication. That's the word Lucius Varenus used in his secret records. Domestication. As if they were training wild animals. The queens were repeatedly assaulted. Not just physically but psychologically. Forced to assume positions of submission. Forced to repeat phrases in Latin that denied their own humanity. Forced to thank their aggressors. And when they resisted, because all of them resisted in big and small ways, the punishment didn't come upon them, but upon Gallic prisoners brought specifically for that purpose. Sons. Brothers. Warriors who had fought beside them. It was a spirit-breaking machine as efficient as Roman siege machines were efficient at breaking walls. Eporedorix resisted for 3 days. She kept silent when they wanted her to scream. Kept her eyes open when they wanted her to close them in shame. Refused to cry, refused to beg, refused to give them anything but silent defiance. On the third day they brought a boy. He was perhaps 10 years old. Red hair, green eyes, common features in her tribe. He was terrified, trying to be brave, failing. "Do you know this boy?" Caesar asked her. Eporedorix didn't know him personally. But she knew his type, the sons of warriors raised to be brave, taught from early on that dying with honor was better than living with shame. "He's Gallic," she said. "That's enough." "He's yours," Caesar said, and his voice had an almost paternal quality. "Your people. Your responsibility. And he's going to die today, slowly and in great suffering, unless you do one simple thing." He held out a cup. "Drink this. It's wine. Roman wine. And as you drink, thank Rome for civilizing you. Say the words. Just say the words and the boy lives. Refuse and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A centurion was already holding a knife to the boy's throat. Eporedorix looked at the boy. He was looking at her with those green eyes, and she could see he was trying to tell her something. Trying to be brave for her. Trying to make it easier. She thought of all the times she'd counseled her people. All the impossible decisions she'd made. All the times she'd chosen between poison and poison, knowing there were no good choices, only less terrible choices. She took the cup. She drank. And as the Roman wine ran down her throat like fire, as she said the words they wanted, "Thank you, Rome, for civilizing me," she looked at Caesar and saw triumph in his eyes. He let the boy go. He kept his promise. In that sense he had honor. But Eporedorix understood, in that moment, that there were things worse than dying. There was surviving knowing you'd broken. There was carrying the weight of having chosen your own humiliation to save one life, knowing that humiliation would save exactly one life while condemning your memory forever. She'd made the right choice, and it destroyed her. The other queens broke, one by one, in different ways. Some broke quickly on the first day. The terror was too much, the pain was too much, the realization that no one was coming to save them was too much. Some resisted longer. A queen named Velida didn't break at all. She died on the 5th day, her heart simply stopping after hours of torture. The Romans were almost irritated. She'd ruined the spectacle by refusing to participate. But most broke the way Eporedorix had broken. Not because they were weak, but because the Romans understood exactly how to attack. They didn't just torture bodies. They tortured connections. Love. Loyalty. The very things that make people human. They forced queens to watch other queens being assaulted. Forced them to choose who would be punished first. Forced them to participate in each other's humiliations, turning victims into accomplices, destroying even the solidarity that might have offered comfort. It was a system. A machine. And it worked with terrible efficiency. In Lucius Vorenus's secret records, there's one line that haunts everyone who reads it. "Today I saw men who fought bravely against Germans and Britons vomit after watching what we did to the Gallic queens. And yet no one stopped. No one spoke. Because orders are orders and Rome is Rome." After 2 weeks, the queens were no longer recognizable. Physically, they'd healed. The Romans were efficient at medicine too, keeping them healthy enough to continue the process. But psychologically, spiritually, they were broken in ways that had no words. Eporedorix spent hours staring at nothing. When she spoke, it was in whispers. When she ate, forced to eat because the Romans wanted to keep them alive, she vomited soon after. That's when Caesar implemented the next phase of his plan. The queens wouldn't be killed. They wouldn't even be kept prisoner in the traditional way. Instead, they would be rehabilitated. Each queen would be given to a centurion as a domestic slave. Not a sexual slave. Caesar was specific about that. He wanted something more insidious. They would be forced to perform domestic work. Clean. Serve wine during dinners. They who had ruled tribes would be reduced to servants. "And when my centurions return to Rome," Caesar explained during a council with his officers, "they'll bring these women. And everyone in Rome will see Gallic queens humbly serving their Roman masters. The message will be unmistakable." A young tribune dared to ask a question. What if they try to escape? Or kill themselves? Caesar smiled that snake smile. They won't. Because each one will receive information. There will be a member of her tribe, a son, a brother, a child, kept somewhere under Roman guard. As long as they serve faithfully, these people will live. If they try to escape. He didn't need to finish. It was slavery maintained not by chains but by love. The cruelest of all bonds. Eporedorix was given to centurion Marcus Flavius. Marcus was a veteran soldier, 37 years old, originally from a village near Rome. He'd spent 15 years in the legions, rising from common infantry to centurion command through competence and survival. He wasn't cruel by nature. He didn't like what he'd witnessed in recent weeks. But he was Roman to his core, believed in order, in discipline, in the superiority of Roman civilization over barbarism. And he had his orders. "You will cook my meals," he told her on the first night. His voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind. It was practical. "You will keep my tent clean. You will serve when I receive guests. You will treat me with appropriate respect from a servant to her master. In return, I won't be harsh with you, and the child we hold for your sake will live comfortably." Eporedorix listened without expression. The woman who had once commanded warriors was gone. In her place was a shell that performed tasks mechanically. But Marcus noticed something. Late at night, when he should be sleeping, she stayed awake. And sometimes he heard her whisper words in Gaulish. Words he didn't understand, but that sounded like prayers. She was trying to remember. Trying to keep some piece of who she'd been. Months passed. Winter came to Gaul. The legions began preparations to return to Rome in the spring. The conquest was complete. Alesia had fallen. Vercingetorix was in chains. And the Gallic queens were serving wine to Roman officers. But on a cold December night, something changed. Marcus woke to the sound of whispers. He rose silently, approached the partition that separated his space from the small corner where Eporedorix slept. She wasn't sleeping. She was sitting with a piece of charcoal, drawing on the tent wall. Symbols. Words in Gaulish. Stories. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded. Eporedorix didn't jump. Didn't seem frightened. She simply looked at him with eyes that finally, for the first time in months, had something like life in them. "Remembering," she said. "Remembering what?" "Who we were." Marcus should have erased the drawings. Should have punished her. Those were orders. Erase everything Gallic, replace with Roman. But something in those eyes stopped him. Something in the simple dignity of that act, using charcoal to carve memories into tent leather, touched something in him that years of military training had tried to kill. "If Caesar finds out," he began. "He won't," Eporedorix said calmly. "You'll erase this before anyone sees. But tonight, for just a few hours, this exists. And that matters." Marcus looked at the symbols. He couldn't read them. But he could see what they represented, the refusal to disappear. The insistence that something besides Rome had value. He returned to his bed without saying more. By morning the drawings had been erased. But Eporedorix had a small piece of charcoal hidden in her clothes. And she began to plan. Spring came. The legions prepared to march to Rome. Vercingetorix would be taken first, in a special cage built for Caesar's triumph parade. Behind him, wagons carrying Gallic spoils, gold, weapons, works of art. And among those wagons, walking on foot because Caesar wanted Rome to see them humiliated, the queens. Eporedorix knew that once they reached Rome, there would be no escape. The city was a fortress and Gallic slaves would be watched closely. If anything was going to happen, it had to be during the march. She began talking to the other queens. Not openly, that would be impossible. But in stolen moments when they served meals in adjacent tents. Exchanged glances. Words whispered in Gaulish that their masters didn't understand. "There's a place," she told a queen named Brigantia, 3 days north of the Roman road. "A sacred forest where the Druids performed rituals. If we could reach it." "They'd hunt us," Brigantia replied. Months of servitude had broken her voice to a whisper. "And kill the hostage children." "The children are dead anyway," Eporedorix said, and there was terrible clarity in her voice. "Do you really think Caesar will release them? We're tools, Brigantia. And when tools are no longer useful." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Brigantia looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. One by one, Eporedorix passed the message. Some queens refused, too broken, too frightened, or perhaps just too realistic to believe escape was possible. But 5 agreed. 5 queens who still had sparks of who they'd been. They began stealing. Small things that wouldn't be missed. A kitchen knife. Some rope. Stale bread hidden in clothes. And during the daily marches they memorized terrain looking for possibilities. The opportunity came in the 3rd week. The Roman column was crossing dense forest when a storm arrived. Not an ordinary storm. A deluge that turned the road to mud, that made even experienced legionaries struggle to maintain formation. In the chaos, Eporedorix made her move. She'd noticed that her guard, a young legionary named Gaius, had the habit of stepping slightly away during marches to urinate. It was a small disciplinary lapse, but enough. When he turned, she drove the stolen knife into his back. Not deeply, she no longer had the strength to kill a grown man with one blow, but enough to make him fall. She was running before he hit the ground. Brigantia and 3 other queens followed. They ran into the forest, mud sucking at their feet, rain blinding them, branches whipping their faces. Behind them, shouts. Orders. The sound of organized pursuit. They ran. They lasted 2 days. 2 days in the forest, drinking from streams, eating roots and bark, moving constantly because they knew Roman trackers were coming. On the second night, hiding in a damp cave, Brigantia said, "It was worth it. 2 days of freedom. Worth more than years of servitude." Eporedorix wanted to believe that. But she knew the Romans. Knew Caesar. The punishment for this escape would be terrible, and not just upon them. The trackers found them at dawn on the 3rd day. There was no fight. They were too exhausted, too weak. They were chained and dragged back to the column. Caesar was waiting personally. His face showed no anger. It showed something worse, disappointment. Like a father disappointed with a disobedient child. "You killed a legionary," he said calmly. "You disrupted my march. You caused inconvenience." He walked among them, studying each face. "The punishment for killing a legionary is death by crucifixion," he continued. "That's law. But you're lucky. I'm merciful." The word merciful in Caesar's mouth sounded like poison. "You won't be crucified," he said. "Instead, you'll watch as the children held as hostages are executed. Each one of you. You'll watch the child we kept alive for your sake die slowly. And then you'll continue serving. Because death is an ending and I won't grant you endings." Eporedorix closed her eyes. She'd known the cost. She'd chosen to try anyway. But knowing a cost and watching it be paid are different things. The executions happened that afternoon. 5 children. Ages 6 to 12. Hanged on improvised structures while the queens were forced to watch. Eporedorix watched the child who'd been kept for her sake, an 8-year-old boy she'd never met, but whose life had been intertwined with hers anyway, die slowly. It took 8 minutes. She counted every second. And then Caesar did something even worse. He made the queens cut down the bodies. Prepare them for burial. Forced them to be accomplices not just with their silence but with their hands. It was methodical destruction of the soul. The march continued. Rome approached. Eporedorix no longer spoke. Neither did the other queens who tried to escape. They performed their tasks mechanically, empty bodies going through motions. Marcus Flavius watched his servant and felt something that might have been guilt, but that years of military conditioning transformed into discomfort. He hadn't ordered the executions, hadn't performed them, but he'd stood and watched without protesting. Orders were orders. Rome was Rome. One night he tried to talk to Eporedorix. "What did you hope to gain?" he asked, not cruelly but genuinely perplexed. "You had to know you couldn't escape. Had to know what would happen." Eporedorix looked at him. Her eyes had no tears. They were dry as sun-bleached bones. "I hope to remember," she finally said, "what it was to make a choice. Even if it was a bad choice. Even if it led to death. You can't understand that, Roman. You've never lived without choices. Never had every decision, every action, every thought controlled by another." "I'm a soldier," Marcus said. "I follow orders. It's not so different." "You chose to be a soldier," Eporedorix replied. "That's the difference you can't see." Marcus had no answer to that. He returned to his bed but didn't sleep. They arrived in Rome in May. The city appeared on the horizon like a vision, larger than anything the Gallic queens had ever imagined. Temples that touched the sky. Aqueducts that carried water through impossibilities. Streets that stretched organized in perfect grids. It was impressive. It was terrifying. It was physical proof that Rome wasn't just another tribe, but something entirely different. Caesar's triumph would happen in 3 days. During that time, the captives were kept in special facilities, prepared for display. Vercingetorix had his chains polished. Gallic gold was arranged for maximum visual effect. And the queens were dressed in garments that were simultaneously opulent and humiliating, fine silks that made it clear they were property, not leaders. On the night before the triumph, something unexpected happened. Marcus Flavius came to Eporedorix. He carried something wrapped in cloth. "Tomorrow," he said, "you'll walk through the streets of Rome. Everyone will see you. And you'll have a choice." He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small knife, not a kitchen knife, but a legionary's knife, sharp enough to pierce armor. "You can use this on yourself," Marcus said quietly. "During the parade. Before all of Rome. Turn Caesar's celebration into tragedy. Or you can use it on another. There are guards everywhere so you wouldn't get far, but..." Why? Eporedorix interrupted. Why are you doing this? Marcus was silent for a long moment. Because you were right, he finally said. About choices. About what it means to have none. I've been thinking about it. About what we did. About what I witnessed and didn't speak against. He paused, and for the first time Eporedorix saw something human in his eyes. Not pity, something deeper. Recognition. I can't free you, he continued. Can't undo what was done. But I can give you this. One final choice. What you do with it is yours. He left the knife and departed. Eporedorix stared at the blade for hours. She could end it all. One quick stroke and the pain would stop. There would be no more humiliation. No more serving wine to men who destroyed her world. But then she thought of the Druids, of words carved into ancient temples. We are more than bodies. And she understood what she needed to do. Caesar's triumph was the greatest Rome had seen in a generation. The streets were packed with citizens, thousands of them shouting and applauding as the procession passed. First came the wagons of spoil. Gallic gold gleaming under the sun. Captured weapons. Works of art. Then came the captives. Gallic nobles in chains, forced to walk barefoot on hot stones. They tried to maintain dignity, but the crowd showered them with mockery and occasionally thrown objects. Then came Vercingetorix, the great Gallic leader in an elaborate cage pulled by slaves. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, refusing to give Rome the satisfaction of seeing him broken. And behind him, walking in a line, the queens. They'd been dressed to appear both exotic and subjugated. Their clothes were too fine for Roman decency, but ornate enough to show they were valuable prizes. They walked barefoot, chains connecting them to each other. The crowd grew louder. Comments were shouted, some cruel, some lewd, all blithely ignorant of who these women had been. Eporedorix walked in the middle of the line. The knife Marcus had given her was hidden in the folds of her dress. She could feel it against her skin, cold and sharp. One final choice. She looked around, at Rome's impressive temples, at the screaming crowds, at the physical evidence of the power that had destroyed her people. And she understood that killing herself, killing a guard, any violence, would only confirm what Rome believed about the Gauls. Barbarians. Violent. Incapable of civilization. But if she simply walked, if she survived, if she refused to disappear. Eporedorix let the knife fall through an opening in her robe. She heard the faint clink when it hit the street stones. No one else noticed. And she began to whisper. Words in Gaulish. Not loud enough for the guards to hear as threat, but loud enough for the other queens to hear. She was telling a story. The story of how Gaul was created. The story of the first kings and queens. The story that Druids taught children, the story that connected every Gaul to their ancestors. One by one the other queens joined. Their voices blended, creating a harmony that cut through the roar of the Roman crowd. The crowd didn't understand the words, but they understood the act. And for a moment, just a moment, there was silence. These women, naked and chained, walking through their day of greatest humiliation, were singing. It was the most terribly beautiful thing many Romans had ever witnessed. And the most subversive. Because it proved that you could break bodies, but some things, memory, identity, the refusal to disappear, resisted. After the triumph, Vercingetorix was taken to the Tullianum, Rome's deepest, darkest prison. He would die there 6 years later, strangled as Caesar had promised. The queens were distributed among Roman officers. Eporedorix remained with Marcus Flavius, who was now a junior senator, his reward for loyalty during the Gallic Wars. But something had changed. The singing during the triumph had been noticed. Whispers ran through the halls of Roman power, whispers about indomitable barbarians, about women who refused to be civilized, about the disturbing possibility that conquest wasn't as complete as it seemed. Caesar didn't like these whispers. 2 months after the triumph, he issued an order. All Gallic queens must be separated. Sent to different parts of the empire. Prevented from contact with each other. It was recognition in its way that they were still dangerous. Not physically, what could 5 broken women do? But symbolically. As long as they existed, as long as they remembered, Rome's conquest of Gaul was incomplete. Eporedorix was sent to Hispania. Brigantia to Germania. Others to Africa, Asia, to the ends of the known world. Caesar ensured they would never see each other again. Eporedorix lived another 23 years. She spent those years as a domestic slave in a Roman villa in Hispania, property of Marcus Flavius, who'd been assigned there as provincial administrator. Superficially, she performed her duties. Clean. Served. The perfect obedient slave. But secretly, she did something Caesar had tried to prevent. She remembered, and taught others to remember. There were other Gallic slaves in the villa. Some had been captured in the same wars. Some were children born into slavery who'd never seen free Gaul. For these, Eporedorix became teacher. Late at night, when the Romans slept, she gathered young slaves and told stories. The same stories the Druids had told her as a child. Stories of how the world was created. Stories of heroes who fought against impossibilities. Stories of queens who ruled with wisdom. She taught them words in Gaulish. Not many, just enough so they knew their native language wasn't Latin. Just enough to plant seeds of separate identity. And she told them about Alesia. Not the version the Romans taught, the story of barbarism tamed by civilization. But the true story. The story of people who fought against an empire. Who resisted even knowing they would lose. Who refused to disappear without leaving marks. You need to remember, she told a 7-year-old slave child named Catamaris, whose name meant great in battle, though he'd never hold a sword. You need to remember that we were more than what Rome says we were. That we had kings and queens. That we had laws and poetry and gods. That we were a people. But we're Roman now, Catamaris said, confused. Master says we're lucky. Rome gave us civilization. Eporedorix looked at this boy born a slave. Who would never know freedom. Who would probably die a slave serving Roman masters. Yes, she said softly. We're Roman now. But before we were something else. And that something else deserves to be remembered, even if it can never return. Eporedorix died in 29 BC, at 51 years old. She died not of violence or dramatic illness, but of simple exhaustion. Her body, used by decades of hard labor, simply refused to continue. Marcus Flavius, now an old man himself, was present when she died. You had a strange life, he said to her in those final hours. A queen who became a slave. A leader who spent decades serving. Eporedorix looked at him with eyes that were losing focus. No, she whispered. I was always a queen. Slavery was just something that happened to my body. Not to my soul. They were her last words. Marcus arranged for her to be buried decently, not in a common slave pit, but in a small grave with a marker stone. It was a small act of respect. Perhaps expiation. On the stone he carved, Eporedorix. Of Gaul. Just that. But in an empire where slaves rarely received even their names carved, it was something. The story could end here. Queen becomes slave, lives life of servitude, dies obscure. The end. But stories have ways of refusing to end. 20 years after Eporedorix's death, something extraordinary happened. A revolt broke out in Hispania. Not a major revolt. Nothing that seriously threatened Roman power. But notable because it was led by slaves. Slaves who organized, who coordinated, who fought with strategy uncommon for slave insurrections. And when Roman historians recorded the revolt, they noted something strange. The rebels used Gallic symbols. Sang songs in Gaulish. Invoked names of Gallic gods. One name appeared repeatedly in the accounts, Eporedorix. The rebels called her, the Queen Who Remembered. They said she'd planted seeds that flowered into resistance. The revolt was crushed. Rome didn't tolerate rebellion. But the records remained. And over the following centuries, other small revolts occurred. In different parts of the empire. Among slaves and conquered peoples. And many invoked memories of pre-Roman leaders. Stories that had been told in secret, passed from slaves to slaves, refusing to die. Memory, it turned out, was harder to kill than people. Now we fast forward 2,000 years. In 2003, archaeologists working at the ruins of Alesia made a discovery. Beneath the remains of a Roman villa, they found a secret cellar. And on the walls of that cellar, carvings. Names. Names of women, written in ancient Gaulish. Prayers. Not to Roman gods, but to Celtic gods the empire had tried to erase. And stories. Fragments of stories, scratched into stone with improvised tools, preserved by the luck of collapsed walls that sealed the cellar and protected it from further destruction. A team of specialists spent 3 years translating the carvings. What they discovered confirmed what had always been suspected but never proven. The fate of the Gallic queens was far worse than official accounts admitted. But they discovered something more. Among the story fragments were instructions. Directions for teaching children. Methods for preserving language. Strategies for maintaining identity under occupation. It was a manual for resistance. Written by women who knew they wouldn't see freedom, but who were determined that their descendants would at least remember that freedom had existed. The discovery made headlines for a week. Then, like most archaeological news, it faded from public attention. But in universities, among Celtic history specialists, a debate began about how much of Roman history was propaganda, about how many voices had been silenced, about what it means to write history when victors control all the records. In 2009, another discovery. In a French monastery during renovations, workers found a medieval manuscript. Inside its binding were older pages, Roman papyrus incredibly well preserved. It was the secret record of Lucius Vorenus, the scribe who documented the conquest of Gaul. His unedited copy, the one that included everything Caesar's Commentaries omitted. The descriptions of what happened to the queens after Alesia were explicit. Painfully explicit. Lucius hadn't spared details, perhaps because he felt the record was important. Perhaps because, in his way, he was trying to preserve truth he knew would be buried. The manuscript included something more. Near the end, Lucius had written a personal entry. 30 years I've served Rome. Fought on 3 continents. Witnessed triumphs and defeats. And I can say with certainty, what we did at Alesia wasn't victory. It was murder disguised as civilization. The Gallic women had more dignity in chains than we had putting them there. May the gods, Roman or Gallic, forgive us. I cannot. It was an extraordinary admission. A Roman admitting that conquest was crime. That civilization was lie. That the victims were right to resist. So what do we learn? What do we take from this brutal story? First, history is written by victors, but truth is more persistent than victory. Caesar wrote his Commentaries to justify his wars. To transform conquest into a narrative of civilization defeating barbarism. And for 2,000 years that was the story most people knew about Gaul. But the truth, buried in cellars, hidden in manuscripts, carved into walls by women using nails and bones, refused to die completely. Second, violence against women in war isn't accidental. Strategic. Caesar didn't order the profanation of Gallic queens out of casual cruelty. He did it because he understood that destroying female symbols of power was essential to destroying resistance. That publicly humiliating women leaders sent messages to all women. This is the cost of power. This is what happens when you challenge patriarchal order. It's a strategy that's been used in every war since. From comfort women in Japan during World War II, to systematic rape in Bosnia, to the use of sexual violence as a weapon in Syria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The logic is always the same. Destroy not just bodies but the very idea that women can have agency, power, dignity. Third, resistance doesn't require victory to have meaning. Eporedorix didn't defeat Rome. The Gallic queens didn't free their people. They died slaves, their lives consumed by servitude. But they refused to disappear silently. They remembered. They taught. They carved their stories on whatever surfaces they could find. And 2,000 years later we're here reading about them. Learning their names. Honoring their memory. That's resistance. Not the spectacular victory of hero stories, but the quiet stubbornness of refusing to be erased. Fourth, accomplices are as important as perpetrators. Marcus Flavius didn't order the atrocities. Didn't personally execute them. But he stood and watched. Followed orders. And for decades owned a woman whose life he'd helped destroy. In the end, he made small acts of redemption. The knife, the decent burial. But small acts don't undo great crimes. History is full of Marcus Flavius types. People who aren't monsters but who enable monstrosities. Who follow orders. Who tell themselves they're just cogs in the machine, not responsible for what the machine does. But machines are made of people. And every cog has choice. There's an epilogue to this story. In 2015, a group of modern Celtic women, contemporary Druids practicing reconstructed ancient religions, traveled to Alesia. They performed a ceremony at the site where the secret cellar had been found. It wasn't political protest. It wasn't historical reenactment. It was simply acknowledgement. They spoke the names of the 13 queens aloud. For the first time in 2,000 years, those names were pronounced in the place where these women made their last stand. They poured libations. Sang songs in reconstructed Gaulish. Left offerings, not gold or weapons but paper and pens. Tools of remembrance. And they carved on a new stone, installed near the archaeological site. To the queens of Alesia. You were broken but not silenced. Enslaved but not erased. Defeated but not forgotten. Your resistance echoes through centuries. Your example remains. So here's the truth that Julius Caesar tried to bury, that Rome tried to erase, that 2,000 years of history almost managed to forget. What happened to the Gallic queens after Alesia wasn't just violence. It was systematic attempt to destroy the very idea that women could lead. that conquered peoples could maintain identity, that resistance had meaning even in defeat. They were stripped, raped, publicly humiliated. Not by momentary rage but by calculated design. They were transformed into symbols, walking warnings of what happens when you defy Rome. They were enslaved in ways specifically designed to break spirits, forced to serve those who destroyed their world, kept obedient not by chains but by hostages, prevented from even properly mourning their lost people. And when dying would have been mercy, they were kept alive. Because dead they might have become martyrs. Alive, broken, serving, they were living messages. But here's what Caesar didn't anticipate. You can't completely destroy memory. You can't totally erase identity. You can't make people disappear while someone, somewhere, refuses to forget. The Gallic queens lost everything. Their tribes, their lands, their bodies, their lives. But they kept one thing, the refusal to accept Rome's narrative about who they were. And they passed that refusal forward, in whispers and stories and secret carvings, until centuries later, the truth could finally emerge. It's a brutal story. It's a story of almost incomprehensible suffering. But it's also a story about the unbreakable power of human memory. About how, even in the most desperate circumstances, people find ways to resist. Not with weapons. Not with revolutions. But simply by refusing to disappear. Today, if you visit Alesia, you'll find a museum. Dioramas show Roman soldiers and Gallic warriors. Replicas of weapons fill display cases. And there's a section about daily life in Roman Gaul. It's all very educational. Very sanitized. But if you know where to look, if you go down to the research area and back, if you ask to see the carvings from the cellar walls, you'll find the real story. Names of women. Scratched into stone. Preserved by 2 millennia of luck and stubbornness. Eporedorix. Brigantia. Velita. And 10 others whose names were too damaged to read clearly. They deserve to be remembered. Not as victims, though they were victims. Not as symbols, though they became symbols. But as people. People who ruled with wisdom. Who fought with courage. Who resisted even when resistance was futile. Who refused to let their peoples be erased without leaving marks. What Julius Caesar did to the Gallic queens after conquest was designed to be worse than death. Designed to break not just bodies but spirits. Designed to send a message that would last centuries. But messages can be rewritten. And stories once buried can be unearthed. This is the legacy of the queens of Alesia. Not victory. Not revenge. Simply this. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells their stories, they haven't disappeared completely. And that, in the end, is resistance enough. We are more than bodies. We are memory. And memory, it turns out, is the hardest thing of all to kill.